Okay. Rachel, are we recording?
We're recording.
Excellent. It is Tuesday, November 27, 2018. We are gathered together informally to have an informal Moab City Council and Moab Planning Commission meeting where we would like to just have an open conversation about items regarding growth and density. A lot of conversations about the pad. So that is what we are here to do tonight. And I'm going to turn this over to Karen and Marianne, who really encouraged this meeting to come together and happen. Thank you both for presenting the idea for all of us to come together to talk.
Great. So just to bring you all up to speed with a little bit of history of where we're at in this project is the Planning Commission, who I'd like to let you know is a non-political body. We were asked to come up with a problem for our housing crisis. So Moab in the 80s started being developed into a tourist economy. That economy brought a lot of people here. All of those people came with jobs, and they expanded our social needs. They expanded our hospital, our library, our jails. And so now we have this housing crunch where we don't have enough houses for the people who live here. So that's leading to problems like our hospital is maybe not giving you the best care possible because we can't select a big enough population of people to choose to live here. We have hospital workers who are living in RVs and trying to make those permanent homes. So this isn't just about the seasonal workers who come in here and maybe don't have a place to live. This is about our entire population of our community. And so we're looking for housing solutions in our very small desert region that we can all be happy with. And so as a planning commission and as a city council of your elected officials, we'd like to come together tonight and talk about what the best solutions could be for creating more housing in the city of Moab. So we have a lot of resources here besides ourselves. We have a high-density, low-income housing specialist. We have our lawyer, and we have our city manager. We have Emily, who created community rebuilds to address this problem. We have a developer, designer, architect. We have a lawyer. We have a lot of concerned citizens and other developers. So I'd like to just start the meeting with going over our primary concerns with the planned affordable development as it is right now. And then some of the qualified people who are here can address some of those concerns that we have. So the way that I'd like to do that is to have everyone at this table write down their concern on this piece of paper, and then we as a group will address that legitimate concern and answer questions. And then at the end of this meeting in about an hour, I'd like us to start thinking, or less than an hour, I'd like us to start thinking about some potential solutions to these problems that we write here on this paper. So
to the pad specifically?
To the pad.
Okay, so we're really focused on the pad tonight.
So, no, we can most definitely focus on housing.
Okay.
So, in that case, I'd like our first comment to be everyone write down their first problem with housing and with not having high-density housing or not having enough housing in our city. If you don't think this is a problem and you want it to go somewhere else, you can write that down too.
On that pad of paper?
On this pad of paper.
So just come right on over and...
Yeah.
Okay. And then we'll slap it up and talk about it.
And then we'll talk about it. Put it in the middle.
Is it a sticky? Can we put it on the wall?
Yeah, we could just put it on the wall.
It's a little harder to write on the wall, I will say. If we could, it might be quicker if we save it on the table.
I think so.
Just inexperienced. I know, I'm not a teacher.
Okay. So again, what is the number one problem with housing in general?
Yeah, what's your number one housing concern? What's the problem? What are possible problems of not having enough housing in our city?
sort of been,
Okay, first
because
question.
this has been
Yeah.
somewhat answered by the affordable housing plan, but
Right.
this is, the problems are documented and quantified there.
So are we just kind of?
Let's start with the general plan. Why are we having a housing crisis? What's the problem?
I think we all know what the crisis is. I think we have concerns about how we're approaching it, how we're approaching the solution. That would be my view of it.
Okay,
We
so
all know
let's
it's
do,
a crisis.
okay, so let's do players in the game. Who's being affected by the housing crisis?
And I think we all know that.
Okay.
And I think that's what the study showed us. And maybe I'm speaking out of turn. But I think the issue is not that we don't have a crisis. We know we do. And I think the issue is not how many people it affects, because we know that. It affects everybody in the community as a whole. But I think the issue is how we're implementing our solution and if we have concerns with it. Because right now our solution is a patch.
Right.
One tool among many.
So,
Well, we got past the what group?
right.
And we also did purchase one land to go into redevelopment. Maybe it would be better if we like dialed into the pad. Started with the pad and maybe got bigger.
Okay.
And because, well, just that might be an easier question to pose, but.
Okay, opposition to the pad. Let's write our questions down on the paper for why are we opposed to the pad? Or why are we in support of the pad? Comments on the pad?
Comments on the suggest one alternative.
Sure.
What I hope you might do is go around, for example, I have a list of things I should do quite concisely that I would like planning commission and staff to investigate, provide some data on that would help me resolve how to deal with peculiarities of the pad where it might apply.
I don't have this one.
Or were those the comments that you made last time? I would encourage you to write that down on this paper, and you can take as much time as you need to write down your comments. Just so that we know.
And just for those that are joining us to witness this workshop, basically the idea from Karen and Marianne was that they really wanted us to come together and have a bit of a more informal conversation. So even the structure of how we're going to be communicating and talking and working through these issues, this is very informal, but thank you all for coming to at least participate in watching this, if nothing else. If it looks a little messy, it's because we're trying to be more like a workshop than a formal meeting. What did you write?
Unlimited density without form-based guidance.
Form-based guidance. That's well spoken.
This
Predictable.
This must be riveting for the online audience.
Yeah, right.
This is sausage making in its truest form.
Oh, it's like tofu making.
Yeah, we know it's informal because Karen's writing diagonal.
We're discussing growth and density generally.
Good work, Karen.
I'm just trying
Yeah.
to absorb.
The guidance was a little.
Oh, I blew it. I didn't bring my water
thumbs up.
bottle. I'm gonna go get a glass of water. Does anybody need water?
Good, thank you.
Okay, we'll wrap it in.
I'm gonna wait. Well, no, I think I'll probably just address things as they come up.
Yeah.
I think I know what some things are gonna be, and I have things I'd like to say.
Okay, that's totally fine.
Hour? We had 2 hours.
Scheduled till 8.
Yeah.
Scheduled till 8.
Yeah.
my youngest girl,
Parent capacity.
East Coast, West Africa.
I was gonna say, it looks like it's,
And
From
she
somewhere
met her
authentic.
future husband there from Guinea, and he was working in Cote d'Ivoire at the time. And she got him over here on a fiancé visa, and they were married for about 5 years. It didn't last. But what he did there and here is he made party clothes for West African women. So they now both live in Denver. Aurora turns out to be a hotbed of West African immigration. And he now drives Uber taxi now. And been known to make motorcycle clothes, but he still makes clothes for women. But he's made me over the years a number of shirts, and these way cool. He tells me this is a genuine West African fabric.
it's really pretty. I really like it.
So he makes them. Yeah, I mean, he just. I have a close relation.
Skills I don't have.
They've been divorced. They've been divorced for a few years now, but I'm still closer to him than I am my other girl's husband.
You know, it happens that way sometimes.
Where's your family live anyway? You have brothers and sisters or what?
I have kind of a complicated family. My mom is in Minnesota. I have a half brother who lives in Wisconsin. And he's my dad's stepdad. He's 10 years older than me. And my two stepsisters as well from my mom's twine, just about my age. That's why I'm like a couple years up here. One's in Salt Lake City doing her PhD at the U, and then the other lives in Ohio, and she's an actor there. And then my dad and his partner lives in Montana. They're actually going down to visit. They should be landing in Grand Junction soon. So yeah, gotta get home after this. Got house guests.
So how'd you find your way out here?
My job. Yeah.
Chair.
Yep.
Feel comfortable with
Applied
this.
and
So
got
you
it.
applied from Wisconsin and they hired you?
Well, no, I was in Alaska actually. When I applied, I was doing a clerkship
Yes
for
and
a
no.
year after graduating from law school in Fairbanks. So I was up there and looking for something afterwards and came up and it worked out. I moved here.
While it would not have been
So you having a good time?
I love it. It's great. Yeah.
excitement around the.
We're going up to, I've been up to Alaska once. You said you were in Alaska?
I was in Alaska, yeah. Fairbanks. Yeah.
So, we're talking about
What'd you put? What'd you put?
Well, this
a
is
friend of ours who's moving up there to be next to her daughter.
Oh, it's awesome.
And so we're gonna go to
Awesome.
Anchorage and stop off at
But it's relative.
Skagway on the way out.
Yep.
But once, and there's only so many council meetings I can miss. I'm gonna miss one anyway.
Somebody's
Would I
ringing.
have time to drive all the way up there, you think?
think
And
mine
make a
It was
side trip
me.
up to Fairbanks, past
Mom, I'll call you back.
So important here.
It depends how long you have. It's like an
At least if they could get a higher wage.
10-hour
we'll start
drive
to be able
from
to move forward
Anchorage,
with what they
Anchorage
feel is their
to
priority.
Fairbanks.
And some of them don't mind.
But it's worth it. It's the best parts of the state, I think. Sometimes it is. Yeah, you might not have luck, but if you do,
That's exactly why they bought
the
that
park
truck.
itself is incredible, even if you
They don't want to sign a 6-month lease.
Yeah, they would rather have a $700 truck payment than a $300 house payment.
Marianne, I just wanted to ask, so you had just said
But I also
that
know there are lots of families
we're
out
going to wrap this up within the hour?
4 or 5 people in a trailer and mom and dad are both working 2 jobs. And those are the ones that we need a solution for.
True, true, I agree.
Yeah.
I think Pat is a
Yeah.
wonderful idea. It really is, because
But if we got to solutions faster, that'd be fine too.
low income and affordable and go to optional town. You know, that way,
So you can actually pull the paper off and sticky note it, and we could probably do it to the TV if you
because
want.
a smaller home
Just
isn't
be careful
necessarily
as you're
cheap.
ripping it off. Here, set it down.
It's just smaller and more inexpensive. It doesn't mean it's cheaper because by the square foot. Consider a square footage ratio. You can afford it because it's small.
And that's for people that need a 1,000 square foot house because that's what
Yeah.
I can afford.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just you have to have a small home.
So, all right, so thanks for the input. At this point, I just want to remind everybody here that as a group, we are working as a team to find a solution to our housing crisis. So I just want you guys to remember that your tone of this conversation, I would like to be constructive and offering solutions to the problem, which is to fix the housing problem in Moab. So with a little bit help of the city staff, our first comment was that unlimited density without form-based guidance. So this concern is something that, like, the idea that we could be creating unlimited density, and what this could do is it could maybe create like a shanty town kind of a place where you take an acre and you turn it into 36 units per acre, which would be super high density housing, and that it might not look very good. It might lower property values. It might bring unwanted density and crime to neighborhoods. And so this is the primary concern with this. So with the planned affordable development as it stands right now, we have said that the form is based on the International Building Code, and what this could look like is up to the creativity of the developer within the restrictions of the zoning that we set in the overlay district. So what this could look like is housing that's up to 24 feet, so you could have underground parking and 24-foot housing, one parking spot for the first bedroom, and then 0.5 parking spots for every, or one parking spot for every bedroom after that. 1.5.
And also, it's not an overlay. This is not an overlay. Add? Yeah.
Oh, okay, so let me explain that. So the zoning as it stands in Moab does not change. This is an overlay zoning district that would only apply to someone who wanted higher density in exchange. So they would get a higher density development, but the only people who could live there would fit into the HUD guidelines of affordable housing. So this is a zoning overlay district that goes over the existing zone.
But through recording it, it's like a PUD, but that's why the PAD versus the PUD was like the letters work that way. So the property owner would actually submit a planned affordable development instead of a planned unit development. Correct, Summer? And so it's not like an overlay that it's just going to be wherever, but it's more like they would apply, and then it would go through just like a PUD. It would go through that process.
Right. Okay.
But it's an overlay in that it wouldn't change any zone in the code. It would only apply over an existing zone. I think that's what Marianne means.
Yeah. Okay, so we had a little bit of a difference in how we were interpreting the terminology from a planner's perspective and the city perspective. Yeah. Okay, so just so everybody knows, this would be like a proposed development. So this isn't exactly unlimited density. The limitations would be the number of parking spaces, the 24-foot height requirement, and meeting building code. So we're still meeting the building code for the safety and welfare of people in the community. But yes, this could change the urban fabric quite a bit. So from a planning perspective and an unlimited density perspective, Tracy, can you give us any recommendations of how we might keep something huge and unwanted going into a residential area that's primarily single-family homes?
Well, I think that you just hit on it, but by following code, that sort of based on parking and code, you can't really fit as much density. You can't really go, 5 stories high. So I think just by following our code, that this is not going to get that dense.
Does anybody else have comments or questions on that unlimited density without form-based guidance?
I want to
reiterate that setbacks of the underlying zones still apply. In the pad, I think there's been some confusion in the community about, I've seen things that say there would be no setbacks required, which is very far from the truth. It would comply with whatever the underlying zone setbacks are. So if it's R2, it's the same setbacks that you would have for any other single-family house in an R2 zone. That would then still apply for areas where the pad does.
What are other concerns? Because after we go through all of our problems, we're going to come up with possible solutions. So it's really important that we're addressing the concerns so that we can fix them.
Do you want to dig a little deeper?
Well, I feel like I think there's a lot more to form. I mean, like if you look at the Missing Middle website, they talk about various ways of creating more restrictions so that new higher density, without actually having a density limit, you have the new building fit more into the fabric, so it's the neighborhoods maintain their cohesiveness while still allowing the density that we need to solve the problems. And PAD and the city code, as it's formulated, does not, in my opinion, accomplish that. And I feel like that's going to be a much bigger conversation, and I'd like to pass some form of PAD sooner, but then continue that going forward because I also feel like we need to facilitate more housing inventory in general, not just affordable. But again, accomplishing that is and making it politically feasible and not pissing too many people off is just going to require that we pay attention to that. And so yeah, I want to dig in deeper, but we've got, looks like at least a dozen other questions up there and limited time tonight. So I'm happy to just leave it at that and say, I totally get what you're saying and I acknowledge it. And I feel like my question is sort of the concern that we're hearing from residents, or one of the concerns.
Okay. So cohesive urban form should be one of the goals of creating higher density. Okay. So we can think about ways that we can accomplish that, and we have a specialist here. Awesome. Okay, so the next is balance between density, community, and neighborhoods, which we kind of addressed right there, right? So what about the impacts of the health and safety of our communities if we are creating higher density? I think those were some of the concerns with going with higher density in the city of Moab. So again, higher density just means more people, and more people are people, and people do people things, and so of course there can always be problems with higher density. Can anybody add to that?
Yeah, the kinds of things I'm hearing are, we've gotten comments, like even in our last meeting, about concerns about just the effects on mental and physical health of just physical proximity, so some concerns about whether there's adequate open space, but just also, by nature of more density, you may have more code enforcement issues with noise or whatever, so do you have adequate ways to address those concerns?
I think that my question or my concern with that is that I think we need to keep in mind that if we need, and I've heard a lot of numbers thrown around, if we need 300 units that are affordable housing, then I think we really need to consider 10 units instead of one 300-unit thing, because the 300-unit thing is going to piss everybody off.
Well, I do think there has to be an overall map at some point, hopefully sooner than later, where we all look at everything being proposed, because if you look at all the units proposed, say with the Mill Creek Apartments, or all the units that the Land Trust could potentially build, or all the so yeah, at some point, it just seems earlier than later it would help us all too to know what's coming or already potentially in the works. Some of those projects farther ahead than others, but
I just hope that we can keep in mind that the things that are going to fit in our community are going to be the smaller, higher density rather than the huge ones. Because if I live in an apartment complex with 300 people, I'm not going to know anybody. If I live next door to 2 duplexes, I'm probably going to learn those people's names because they are my neighbors. And that's the difference between having affordable housing and an apartment and having affordable housing in our community.
And I will say that the general point of the pad too, at least from my perspective, is that we don't want to create a slum district in Moab. We want to have housing for people who live in our community, who are members of the community, who live here, who work here, who provide things to us, where we're not saying, okay, you're going to be in lower, you maybe qualify for lower income housing, so you're going to be in the lower income housing, and it's all along our commercial corridor, or it's way out on the Sitla parcel. The idea is that you have a more cohesive town if you don't just have, okay, that's where the affordable housing is. It's interspersed in existing housing in the neighborhood. And I think, at least I believe very strongly, that's the way to do it, because it one, doesn't marginalize members of the community. There's, you know, social and environmental justice issues to think about too, where you know, I don't think it's fair or right to give the people who have the least means the worst pieces of property in the city and say you have to live here just because you have to. You know, I think, you know, with what Allison's saying, that we want to be able to say, okay, I have my, you know, single unit family house here, and there's some neighbors on this side, and it's just that interspersing of the community, I think, is healthier for the long run. And I think it's going to end up, a lot of the problems you get with higher density housing inherently aren't necessarily going to happen if you don't have all the high density housing all in one place, which isn't necessarily the most desirable real estate. So
And just to be
that's
clear, I'm not saying it should all be in one
yeah.
place. I'm just
no,
saying
no, no.
when we
I just
discuss these
think
things,
this is
we
an
should
important
know.
point
Yeah, there are
to
some
make
larger
as we think about it.
projects
The reason, I mean, if you look at the zoning map on the wall, everything that is that orangey yellow, that's R2. There's a reason that we need to be able to overlay higher density in different zones, because that's the majority of our zones in the city. And if we exclude R2, for example, from higher density, we're excluding, you know, 2/3 of town. So just something to consider.
Yeah, I would like to point out right now that we can go down to 1/10 of an acre, and nobody is choosing to do that. You could go to 1/10 of an acre and sell it at market rate, and nobody is choosing to do that. So if we created this higher density zoning, would anyone choose to go less than 1/10 of an acre? Would anyone choose to subdivide their property? Because they haven't been recently. So the next one was how to write an ordinance to permit pad in appropriate places, especially residential, and not in other places.
R2.
Oh, especially in R2. So as it stands right now, the pad is only for R2.
What?
No.
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 It's everywhere.
What is?
So Mary, let me clarify that.
Okay, clarify, please.
All right. So first of all, have you guys on Planning Commission had a chance, can you read the ongoing debate that's going on under the working copy of the pad ordinance? Since Summer gave it to us, which came from you guys, it's been put on the city server, and we council have been chewing on it, each of us interjecting our opinions, what we like and what we don't like, suggesting alternative text, comments, and so forth. So you can kind of get a handle on the raging debate that's going on about it. So if you guys had a chance to look at that?
We weren't given access to it.
Okay. So I'll let you guys work out whether you should or not, but if you did, we could short circuit a lot of this conversation, because you know where the debate lies and where it does not.
The purpose of this conversation as a group is for you to bring these questions into the open and for us to open up the conversation.
All right, so let me bring up some of what's going on. So to answer your question about R2, as it came from Summer, or from you guys, it did include R2. I struck it out because I am opposed at this point to blanket putting R2 in.
Okay, so that didn't mean you just want R2. That means you want to exclude R2. Okay.
Can I ask why R2 specifically?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't know you were getting to that.
So additional modifications that have been made include, from your text, includes the 24-foot height thing, okay, and the parking space in R2, 1, 3, or 4 spaces for 1, 2, or 3 bedroom type units. And those are great, all right? Those do, in fact, help mitigate it. And a lot of people here would argue that's sufficient. Go with it, and we'll have that debate. I may yet come around, but right now I'd be more comfortable I will point out that R2 has already taken a hit, as the rest of the town, from the change from family to household. It's more bunkhouses, and the city has yet to deal with it, and Mr. Everett has promised us that we will work on that soon, but that's sure to lead to more houses filled by non-related people and more parking issues and so forth. And we're going to try to mitigate that, but still that's a hit that R2 residents are concerned about. You guys should realize, I don't know if you guys see the email letters, but we've got a world of feedback, pushback from people living in R2 objecting basically to this. And I think some of it is unwarranted, some of it is not unwarranted. So additional mitigations that I might suggest, and I'm just throwing ideas out here for you guys to do, consider is on places in R2 in particular, to require wider streets wide enough to accommodate rows of parking on either side, plus 2 lanes in the middle, so cars can get by. Because I think there'll be a lot of cars parked out on the street. Kaylin has said that's not a bad idea, and it isn't, as long as there's room for cars to get by. So that's one idea. That's a safety argument as well.
Okay, so ample parking should be included in the pad.
Yeah, but not only that, but streets wide enough to accommodate all the parking, on-street parking, and still allow traffic to get by. In other words, for example, I live on Rose Tree. There's no way this would work on Rose Tree, okay, because the street won't, there's maybe 1 lane with two lanes of parking, so it won't go everywhere. Another thing that's commonly been done out in the county when I sat on the planning commission out there was to restrict the so-called density of pad developments. By that I mean if a bread and breakfast was located in a particular block and so forth, and the regulation said you can't have another bed and breakfast within X feet or X yards of that, 100 yards, whatever the number is going to be. So that way that would relieve neighbors' fears that every Tom, Dick, and Harry on their block is going to redevelop into a pad. I don't think that's going to happen anyway, but it would relieve a neighbor's fears.
Okay.
Right.
So as far as parking goes, we wrote into the pad a certain number of additional parking spaces that's not on-street parking.
That's correct.
So.
But yeah, I want you to realize, because pads are typically small and there's very little storage space, I think people will typically use their parking spaces for storage. I'm sure of it. Okay, so I expect even though the spaces are there, you're still going to find a lot of on-street parking. That's my guess. Okay, and then the final thing I want to suggest is there are places, in particular, the undeveloped parcels out on Mill Creek Drive at Powerhouse Lane, where there's a lot of space out there. Ever since, again, when I was on city planning commission out there, I could see that route into town through the 3-way stop there at Mill Creek Drive and on in past Dave's Corner Market, and again at 3rd South and 4th East. That's quite a little dogleg in, and there's a world of people using that. And if there's a large number of people plunked down out there on Powerhouse Lane, the situation will be exacerbated. So that might be another reason for restricting density out in that area, simply because the traffic in the town can't handle it. So those are some of the concessions that I might throw out that would make putting it in R2 more acceptable.
Part of the problem with what you're saying about density and parking and traffic in that part of town, I've had to deal with several different things going on in that section, and I think at this point, the numbers that you would have to do to change the way that traffic is being handled by our streets would be amazing. Because what happens is, it's not us that change, us as planning and zoning people, we don't change routes and things like that. So let's say the Lines Back development, as an example. So there's been a lot of talk about the Lines Back development, if that does come to fruition, about traffic and how Mill Creek and that whole area is going to change. And every development that comes into town has to do kind of a traffic study, especially a larger development. And I'm going to tell you right now, the numbers to change that traffic pattern are way out there. So, you know, I would say if you don't want to go to Powerhouse Lane or any kind of development, I think the city in general will be able to handle that on a case-by-case situation and not say, we're not going to have development out in that part of town because traffic can't handle it. I think what happens is it has to be done on a big case-to-case development, period. Powerhouse Lane is not large enough to handle pretty much any more traffic than it already has on it right now without widening it. I think at that point, doesn't DOT or something like that, at that point, they have to go through a traffic study. So do you understand what I'm saying? You can't say we don't want that over there because it can't handle it. Well, what I'm telling you is that the numbers to change that traffic flow are just incredibly large, a lot larger than you would think.
And we actually do have, Marianne, I don't know if just help, if we put the page to the side, we could pull up the clean draft of the pad, perhaps, if we can, Summer or David or someone, we could doggle.
We're just gonna finish this. We have 7 more questions. We're gonna go through the questions.
It's just to have like some facts, okay. if we wanna reference the pad for fact finding, because there is a traffic study that would be required for that's what I wanted to. I don't remember what the numbers were, but there is 6 units. There is a traffic study trigger, which is all I was gonna say.
There is, and it's typically.
Thanks, Chris.
Under one of the earlier drafts, I'm looking at a red line, but if we've got single-family housing of 50 units or more, or apartments or townhomes of 85 units or more, that would trigger a traffic study requirement in the case of a pad.
I think the point that she's trying to make is that you can trigger a traffic study and they can do the traffic study, but it's not going to affect what happens in the building process. As we've seen, there was a 300-unit apartment building and they did a traffic study, and the traffic study said that the traffic wouldn't make any difference in the patterns out there, which we all know is not going to make any sense. But her point is that the numbers are large in those traffic studies for them to make any difference on what they do in the streets.
No, I don't understand, actually.
Okay.
So clarify for me.
So
when you said the numbers have to be large, are you trying to say that it would take a lot more people than what we're currently anticipating?
Yes.
Before
Exactly.
you'd really run into traffic problems? Is
Yes.
that what you're saying?
Yes.
That's what the traffic studies
That's what
say.
the traffic studies have already said in several different developments.
So this pad considered traffic studies and the housing study and population estimates.
Okay, so, but the issue is we're not dealing with just a regular community where everybody is here year-round. We're dealing with, weekends, and, I mean, our season extended by months here where, a weekend will be 50,000 people, and people are going to Powerhouse and they're going up to Sand Flats, and you're waiting an hour to get up through the booth. I mean, so I know that studies, they have to be larger, but that's not our reality. So how do we deal with what's happening in our community?
That's why I'm saying it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. And I think the pad, has all those triggers, but it has to go case by case. And like I said, the pad, as it's written right now, I think is adequate. I don't think it's perfect, but I think after 8 years of working on it, and
I just like to point out the whole the drive of doing this zoning overlay is that this is going to be market driven. This is still going to be driven by the number of people who are going to require affordable housing. So this isn't like we can just develop a lot of units that sit empty. This density increase is only going to work for the developer if they can fill the units. So we're still following a natural growth rate. We're just providing units for the people who are already there working in the new businesses and the new developments that have already been created.
And working not for the new businesses and not for the new developments. I want to point that out too. This isn't employee housing. This is housing for people in the community who now are living in vans, who are camping out on BLM land because they don't have a place to live. It's people who are, living with friends, crashing on couches, or families who don't have a place. This is not, bunk houses necessarily. This is people who are in the community or part of the community or Grand County voters, Grand County citizens. These aren't the other, these are us.
Okay, so we've kind of addressed this one, which was how will this kill R2 as we know it? And so we all adore R2 as a single family residential area. So I think our guess is that this is going to be like an overcrowded area, and that's our fear. So overcrowding is only going to be determined with parcel size under the pad. So if you have a huge parcel and your concept of overcrowding is 36 units per acre and they can fit that in there in a 1 acre, I can't think of very many 1 acre lots in the R2 that are available right now, which might be developed as housing projects. And again, this is going to be something that's market driven. And that was our concept, is that it will be developed as necessary, like when it's necessary.
Can I go back to my question for Mike? I'm really curious about why there seems to be such a focus other than that, it's the folks that are speaking out, but why is R2, I'm wondering, more of a concern than, say, R3, R4, any of the other residential districts?
Because it's designated for single-family housing. That's why. It doesn't have any high-density residential in it. People like that.
Well, this low-income housing can also be single-family residential housing. It will only be residential, and it can also, it can be single-family, or it can be multiple units within one building. Right now, we have multiple families living in one house. So if you can help me kind of illustrate or draw the lines between how we would make a difference between one house we have right now with multiple families living in it and one building with multiple families living in it.
I don't understand your question, Marianne.
So now, I guess what Marianne is saying...
No, I understand what she said, but I don't understand the intent. It currently says single family. You asserted there's multiple families living in one house that I would expect to see be rare. I'm not saying it may not exist, but most people are single, one family in a single family dwelling. They may have a few unrelated people there, and the number of those unrelated people is about to go up. All right, that was my point about household versus family, and that's a hit that our two people are trying to cope with.
Well, household is just a change legally that we're required to do to comply with fair housing guidelines. We can't say family anymore is the reason that that's being changed. It doesn't necessarily change the character of what it means. It just changes the definition. Chris, I don't know if you want to...
I'd like to point out that what we're trying to avoid is families getting pushed out of our neighborhoods because they can no longer afford to live there. So by creating more housing stock for people who live and work here only, the only people who could go into a higher density are people who live here and work here.
I understand that. I'm saying that I'm trying to address fears of people living in R2. They like their single-family neighborhood. And I only brought up the household stuff because it's another somewhat unrelated hit, if you will, to the density of the neighborhood in addition to the pad. If the change in household hadn't been required by the Fair Housing Act, they might be a little more receptive. All right,
a lot of people are moving into houses together and making them bunk houses. A lot of employees are moving into single-family houses and displacing those families and those opportunities for family housing. So the Planning Commission's concept was that if we increase available land and housing stock, we would increase the opportunities for more units for a diverse population. So we're creating small units for people who want to live in those small units, and ideally allowing the bigger houses for families.
Okay, well, we could belabor this a long time. You might want to move on. I mean, I'd be happy to address Miriam, but you might want to move on.
Okay, so we actually, a lot of these are repeats. We went over open-ended density. We went over the concept of losing family neighborhoods that allow children to play without undue traffic. I'd like to just point out that we're not trying to encourage more people to move here. We're just trying to accommodate the people who already live here in healthier housing situations. And then, let's see, pad is optional, but it's relative pressure for wages. Pad is optional housing, awesome idea, but it's relative to a person's priorities. Wages are so low, how to address higher wages. I'd like to just stick to our zoning conversation and not address higher wages at this point. The us versus them scenario of neighborhoods. Can somebody explain that kind of concept that's come up? Because I'm not familiar with.
I can, because I wrote it.
Okay.
We've had a lot of feedback, and that's what I'm hearing, is if they move to our neighborhood will be degraded. They are us.
Mm-hmm.
These are our teachers. These are our police officers. These are our nurses. And these are the people that are working in our community, like Kaya says, that are living in RVs with their kids. And you talk about, certain zones are single or multifamily dwellings. Families live in apartments. I lived in an apartment with my children, and we were a family for the bulk of my adult life. They are families that we're talking about, and to me, it marginalizes those people. It's like Kaya said, you guys go live over there because we don't want to look out our window and see you.
Right.
But I'd like to point out with that, so your hospital workers and teachers, and when we're talking about the pad, they're not going to qualify because this is low-income housing.
They will. They will qualify. They absolutely will qualify. The average, yeah.
Beginning teacher salaries that are living in RVs, they're going to qualify.
They will. For Moab, the way that HUD arranges their, and this is what our low, moderate, and very low income, which are what these would provide for. Those for Grand County, those numbers are actually pretty reflective of the reality of living in Grand County, and those are adjusted. Emily knows this better than anyone because Community Rebuilds.
Yeah,
works through that program.
Affordable housing developer, like we just built with, for a kindergarten teacher.
Yeah.
We have somebody in our pipeline that's a teacher. So it is teachers that qualify.
So 55, what is it? Because there was different numbers.
55 is the threshold.
55,000 is the threshold
for low income.
And that's low income.
Yeah.
That's low income.
The number changes every year. So that was the 2017 number. Put out by HUD. So I think the current year's number is, I don't know if it's, anyway. Yeah.
But that is for a family of four, and it varies based on household and what the second earner earns. So it's not going to be universal. I mean, some people that we lump in those categories may be excluded because of the household composition, which is why we need to work on inventory in general.
They might, which is another thing that the PAD is striving to solve, is that we are creating, we all know we have an inventory problem. If we're talking about R2, I would say just off the top of my head, I would strain to be able to see any house in any R2 zone anywhere in the city selling for less than $250,000, which is a lot of money.
Which is the threshold for borrowing so if you were gonna borrow, if you were a low-income family, you qualify as low income with USDA, and you were gonna borrow, you can't even borrow 250, I think the cap is 247. So there literally are no homes available for people that are at or below 80% of the area median income. And the median, remember, median is different from mean. It's like where more people are clustered. It's important to recognize that there's a big chunk of us that don't make enough money to buy a home or even rent a home in Moab. And I just want to point out too, the thing that I'm supportive of the PAD, even though we're listing problems, I was the one that wrote supportive, is that what we're saying is that we're willing to grant density, but that density is in exchange for affordability. 80% of the planned affordable development, whether it's a 3-plex, a 4-plex, a 5-plex, a 7-plex, a 10-plex, that 80% of that is going to be affordable and made to be affordable for people in our community. I feel like that's a reasonable trade. And when, before I was mayor and when I was meeting with a lot of members that live in the R2 community, that was a trade that I heard people were willing to make. So that's...
I just want to confirm, I think the last version of the PAD I saw, so did it change, was that up to 4 units, it only needed 50% affordability? So once you jump to 5 units, then you're talking 80.
Well, it's funny because, how do you do 80% of 4 units?
Yeah, the Planning Commission talked about this for hours.
Yeah.
And our math teacher came up with an excellent solution. We all did have this conversation, and I think the solution that we came to, everybody was happy with, for the percentage of affordability that we decided to write into the zoning. The other thing was, has the community been adequately educated and encouraged? And I'd say that our community encouragement and participation has kind of come to a head right here since the 1980s when we decided that this was a tourism town. This has been building up, and now we're at this point where we are right now with the Planning Commission and the City Council sitting down together and saying, let's find a solution. So we are here trying to figure out the solution, and this is just the beginning. So it's 6:58. Let's take a little bit of a break, and then I want to talk briefly about alternatives, and this is a problem-solving session. And then future steps, and I want everybody's input in alternatives and future steps that we think we should take from this point. Okay? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break.
Well, it was, you're right. We sort of touched on it a little bit. It's how many units how much, like Ronnie was saying about water might come in. There's not really that.
I just do think it would be a shame to remove art.
It seems like this. There's so many different numbers.
It's just that we took a lot of steps to tighten more parking than less, and you have to be lower. You have to have more parking.
Like there's not San Juan County's building Harry downtown right.
So I'm wondering why, when that third structure is housing that's somehow cheap, other than just people in the neighborhood.
Well,
And I totally get what you're saying.
I feel fine with PAD almost.
I'm wondering whether the applying to these is
Here's what I think.
Can you estimate
You know, 30
estimate your average or
people rarely are the development.
Yeah, I mean, what I do to do this is I go to
Audrey might know.
and you go to the floodplain mapping map, and then it has a
No, or the discussions we already had.
Three stories will become a
Really came up with this answer. What I'm just thinking about this money, what I would like to see, I think there's a lot of problems that for a lot of reasons are getting sort of put on.
I mean, I don't know the nature of my question about incentives for causing developers to around like what I was like to see
Anyway,
provide changes.
especially here, and I knew this 10 years ago, they're always going to
Because I think trying to change.
Someone's making money.
Trash, I mean.
but I haven't been able to.
Those are all long-term vision questions dealt with years ago. But.
That doesn't work though. But yeah, 80%.
Yeah. So,
related code changes.
I don't know what it would look like
Yeah,
specifically,
I
but
think some of the concerns when people saw 170 square feet or 240 or whatever it was.
occupancy issue, swage, tall walls, some buildings.
Little open space, and how is that? Is that ultimately healthy for people? I don't know. People like pods, so maybe not.
I can't hear them.
Connection to go on now, we're selling it to the business.
Yeah.
If I want to go buy 5 acres of processing place, I'm going to do just what I'm doing. Figuring out the grass, I'm looking for because the first really takes quite a bit to make any profit. The way things are.
Your master brand new use under another name.
Thinking that they're going to find 5 acres.
My God, eye rolling. No, but like, there was eye rolling.
If you can, but as far as the 70%, it's so confusing to me.
It is confusing, but I think
Yeah.
I mean, it would be like the husband.
Because right now, today, you can go down to
What if he was to take
Yeah, exactly, which is why I like to see
Our constituents who.
We're working on the other 20%. He gets to charge what's normal.
Whatever circumstances he's going to be created with.
that's the way this
Like this, such a focus. But I mean, teachers are.
we live like we live right on
I mean, there's so many people that.
we all live right there. We don't live up here.
you like to say.
that's the issue. I think so. The pad allows what's already around.
We hate that reality. Like this, if it's emerged.
Pad doesn't. Men manifest. If you're applying pad in R2, you're essentially.
And you're right about some of the
That's we're not trying to sell it. Yes.
It seemed like that, but I think this now is apply that to R2. And not just when the pad is. Then it would only apply if someone.
we have an issue.
Or I live in R2.
There's been a lot of, we do a lot of things for free. You know, because we do have to sometimes.
We do have to pay the bills.
We have to pay our bills.
Well, that's a good subject to talk about.
Yeah, I'd like to bring that up. Because I think, and I think.
Down by my
It's, you know, I'm the only one that does the wages. Okay?
And I'm not riding 8 miles in the dark.
All right, Mary Ann, pull us back together.
I mean, you cannot take somebody who wants to have.
I think that a lot was accomplished in that 5-minute break. I just want to say a lot was accomplished in that 5-minute break. And I do want to share something that I just asked Audrey Graham just for perspective as we're getting out of the break and moving into solutions. Cinema Court, 4 acres, 60 units.
Oh, that's useful, thank you.
Wait, what was that?
Cinema Court Apartments,
Yep.
4 acres, 60 units. And I'm sure, I mean, we can double check with Ben, but Audrey's here and probably could speak to it too. You probably crammed as many units as you possibly could.
Well, we've designed it well. You did design.
Well, because you have to. And then what is that zone?
Sorry, I'm in the floodplain, but it's 4.4 3/4, but that's including the floodplain, so.
Okay. And then what is the zone for that parcel? I believe it's R4, but I'm not sure. Oh, there you go. There it is, right there.
Marie, I'm orienting myself here.
Yeah. So R4.
So what's the smallest unit?
R4.
Hey, that looks like spots.
Studios?
And how large are those? And that's it. I mean, this pad can be 140 square feet. So
How many?
140.
What?
Isn't that?
As
there
the
was like there was
smallest
as the
unit.
smallest unit. So I mean,
And-
we're not.
Are you telling us that?
Oh, wait, hold on.
Not
hold
at
on, hold
Cinema
on,
Court.
Wait, time out.
Two different questions.
Yes.
That Cinema Court does not have an apartment with 140 square feet. That's what he was saying.
Yes.
What Karen is saying is that this pad, you could build as small as 140 square feet because you're only limited by the building department, not by a minimum size requirement. That was your concern, that I don't know if we really touched on that, but it's probably worth it to say, you know, minimum size. Do we just want to have a minimum size so that we don't see pocket apartments, right?
I agree, yeah.
So that's a reasonable
We talked about this for probably 6 months at Planning Commission.
Yeah.
And voted, the majority of us, not to impose a size requirement because we had the building code restrictions, which already say you have to have this much livable space and that much livable space, and you have to have a kitchen and a bathroom with a door and things like that, and that we couldn't come up with a reason other than just an arbitrary number that would make us feel good for setting a specific size. If the council wants to revisit that, that's fine, but that is at least the conclusion Planning Commission came with. Brian and I argued about this for a very long time.
You came to a compromise and voted. So, Marianne, if it's okay with you too, I would really love to just straw poll the council and the commission, because it feels like, I'm not sure. I would love to hear back from the Planning Commission. You all passed a document, and everybody here voted in favor of the PAD coming to our council. And so, are you all still in favor of the PAD, or have opinions changed? This is my first question. Are you all still in favor of the PAD? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. So as it is right now, you would hope that this council passes this document that you brought to us.
Correct.
And is there, while you still have a concern here or there, like ultimately you would hope this PAD passes?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what we said.
And so this council is like, well, we've got some additional concerns, largely what we've been talking about here. And so moving into this next phase is helpful, because if we can come to having some kind of resolution to satisfy the few concerns that we have, we might be able to have a great working document moving forward. And I just want to, Anne, can I say what you said just now to me? Because, you know, whenever we look out, we just, you know, it's a question mark about over each one of your heads, like, are you in favor of the PAD? Are you worried about the PAD?
Not at all.
And so, well, for Anne, I know how you feel, but for Anne, she's in favor of the PAD. So it's important to recognize too that, like, while we may be making a lot of assumptions, it's important, you know, for us to just say what we're in favor of, what we're not, where we're comfortable with, so that we can move forward with a little more, I don't know, facts instead of question marks and assumptions. So I just wanted to say those things and understand from your planning commission, and then give this council to say, like, of our council, who is in favor right now of passing the PAD, and who is still on the fence, and what are those concerns? I don't get to vote, but I'm very supportive of the PAD, and I just want to give the council a chance to say
I am supportive of it the way it stands. I realize it's not a perfect document. And it's not like it's carved in granite. It can be changed if we find something simply doesn't work. Worst case scenario isn't going to happen because there are constraints with lot size and setbacks and all of the other things that we normally have to consider when a development happens. And all of that goes through planning and zoning and back to us. I don't see anybody building 36 units on an acre. Maybe they will. Maybe I'm wrong, but.
Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
The 80% affordable, that applies to the pad, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's gonna have to just go to the test to see if that's even possible. I understand maybe 2 stories condensed, that may work, but if it takes a long time for developers to get interested in this and they decide that 80% is just not feasible, what does the council do?
Well, then it's just a document we talked a whole lot about that nobody utilized.
Right.
It's gotta be
Well, there are
attractive.
There are other subsidies that, like, people that are building for, low-income families are pulling into their pro forma too.
Well,
So, and Ben Riley with the Housing Authority could speak to that, like tax credits, for example. So while you think like, oh gosh, is this going to be attractive? Maybe not for the, moderate or higher end builder, but for the low income builder, like the Housing Authority, they might be able to actualize a sixplex where there was, a dilapidated home on a larger lot. And it would have more parking than before and lower. Like they did. And we all, have you seen their development on 400 North? So as you're headed toward the sloughs. It's townhomes.
Right, I've seen that, yes.
Yeah. Right, so that's an example
By our
of
houses.
multifamily. Townhomes are a form of multifamily. And actually Karen had a really good idea of me printing out, we sat in a presentation with Utah Land, so many acronyms.
ULCT,
Yeah.
Utah Land and Cities and Towns.
League of Cities and Towns.
League of Cities and Towns. I can drop land of multifamily that looks like single family that I'll put out when you're ready. But it's just to be able to actualize a larger density or more density. If it feels like it doesn't pencil out, it's probably because you don't have access to those affordable housing tools yet. But it is, there are tools out there that can further subsidize the development and make something like that more achievable.
Emily, to that point, how are we going to help facilitate that process?
I think that, it's the responsibility of developers in our community to, look at the pad and see if it works for them. I don't know that it's our responsibility to facilitate as much as it is for us to just put policies out there that could incentivize affordable housing development, and this is one of them.
Well, I think we are going to have to either recruit or we are going to have to publicize that it's there. I don't think our job ends with just passing it.
Well, and I know Salt Lake developers, affordable housing developers, and Tracy, you could probably speak to this too, from St. George. They're looking, to develop in markets, and they've got access to those tools. So I don't want to say if you build it, they will come, because it's like if you policy it, they will build or something. But it's a step.
This was created because the Planning Commission thought that this was the lowest cost solution to our housing problem, was to create more units and thus create housing stock or more opportunities to build units without the city actually building the units and paying for the units themselves.
Yeah, it's a public-private kind of thing.
But that's not to say there aren't other tools in our toolkit that can incentivize building more units? Because we might set this zoning law, you know, we might make this happen, and we might tweak a little bit here and there, but we already can go down to a tenth of an acre, and people aren't really doing that.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
My
Yeah,
neighborhood
they
is.
are. I live on a tenth of an
I
acre.
live on a
Hello.
tenth of an acre. Ty and I both live in Portal Vista, and they're a tenth of an acre.
Yeah.
And there is a developer that is going to develop
More.
the rest of our
neighborhood, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the reason that I think something's really interesting about this is that it's not just saying, so say you're in, I'm just going to think of an R2 neighborhood, so you're up on Tusher and Walker, you're in that neighborhood, right? So that's R2, you have the single household homes. You ideally, if the pad would pass, if you have a particularly large lot, you could stay in your existing home and build smaller units on that, applying the pad. If you had enough room, your existing home would be the market rate home. And then the other units that you could build and provide housing for others, if you had the space or the desire, what have you, could, I mean, this wouldn't just necessarily be, you know, developers coming in, buying a house, leveling it. I think this is the fear, right? They're gonna buy a house in the single family area, level it, and put 16 units in an apartment building or something like that. 3 stories, which in R2 you can already have. You can have a 30-foot structure in R2 tomorrow if you feel like it. But, you know, I mean, there are a few, and I know people aren't really a fan of them, and I'd like to bring up later some maybe in the suggestion period about some ways to maybe assuage some of the symptoms that we're seeing and actually look at what the real problem is instead of just seeing, you know, there's these symptoms that we tend to associate with higher density housing, but if we could solve them citywide, regardless of if the pad is applying or not, I'd like to do that.
You want to start us in that?
Sure, yeah, so.
Wait, sorry.
Go ahead.
We were just gonna have every council member say whether or not they're in favor of the pad right now.
Oh, yeah.
Or if, so.
I am in favor, and I do think I would like to see another version of it. That, I mean, I feel like this will be an evolution. Going back to Brian's point, I would like to see pro formas to see if we're setting the targets at an appropriate level. I feel like they're pretty ambitious, and that's part of the reason why I'm supportive, because it is creating affordable housing, but I also want it to be used, and I'm not sure that they're not too aggressive, and I feel like we could potentially do more to answer that question. And I think there is, the potential for redeveloping some of the perhaps more lower quality housing. Housing here, like the cost of a house here has gotten so expensive that I wonder if redevelopment is a viable option if it's done well. Not just keeping the existing house, but redeveloping and having so that the existing owner can stay there and be in a really well-constructed, energy-efficient home and have income from it, maybe as a retirement option. And then because they already own the land, does that change the economics where they don't have to utilize special financing? I think those are questions that we could at least pencil out to find out if we're even in the ballpark with these targets. And I think that would be a good exercise to do either in the short term if staff has capacity or for the next iteration. But to answer your question, yes.
Others?
Next.
Tawny?
No, I already went.
You already went.
She's already went.
Mike?
Tonight, I would not vote for the ordinance without further support in particular for R2. I'd like to see some more work done on that. I was going to say something brilliant. I was going to say, I like your idea of an owner with a large lot and his existing house can qualify as the market rate house. That's a great idea. I pay a lot of attention to what Brian says. He's a builder, and none of this is worth nothing if nothing gets built. So I like Kaylin's idea of doing a pro forma to see if this is going to pan out or not. One of the problems for all of us is that, again, I remember, I'm not picking on Randy, mind you guys, Randy's great. When we're in the same messy situation as he did when he wanted to put what zoning permitted, 85 homes on 17 acres way out by the golf course, and all the neighbors blew a fuse, all right? And Randy said, well, I'm not gonna put anywhere near that many homes on there, but there was no legal constraint that he couldn't, all right? So that scared everybody, and for the same reason, existing neighbors in R2 are scared what could be done, not what will be done in all likelihood, but what could be done. That's our problem. So I'm trying to separate out, I'm trying to come with some sort of compromise, and in my mind, there are places clearly in R2 where pads can go. I'm for the pad in general. It's a great affordable housing tool, but I'm not ready to sign off and give it blanket approval to R2 all the way across the board right now without further concessions to mitigate concerns of the neighbors. We have people here who've expressed that. We might ask, if you wish, Mayor, to take the time for a short statement. Okay. Okay, that's all. I brought this, my wife. This is how we feel, how I feel anyway. Reading our email letters, I get pressure from city staff, from planning staff, from these guys, and we get a steady stream of letters from people saying, don't you dare. And this is kind of the way I feel. All right? What to do, what to do, what to do. And that's the compromise that I'm trying to work out here, all right? So if you guys want to see what it's like from the other side, I encourage you to run for city council sometime and see what it's like. So.
Do you ever see something you're sure you've never seen ever before? Because I think I just did.
Thank you, Mike.
I don't want to take a lot of time because, frankly, I thought this was going to be a generic discussion about growth and density generally. So hoping we get to some of that. I'm not ready to vote on the pad. My understanding is we had committed to a process. We're going to have the town hall. We're going to have some more meetings. So I will weigh in at that time. But one of the big deals for me, because I feel like it's my job as a city council member, is to represent the residents, whether they're working for someone or they run a business or they just live here, retired or not. And so I am waiting for more input from people and reviewing the pad. And I did have a question from people. I assume there'll be a version of the pad that people in the community can read in our December 11th packet, because people have been asking me, how do we understand there's a working version, but we can't access that. So how do we get, okay. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes, I am in support of the pad, and like Mike, I do have some apprehensions of a blanket R2 open density plan. So I think there's very appropriate places where a pad can go in R2, and I'm still trying to work out the overall R2 zone.
Okay, so this obviously R2 is a sticking point, okay?
Yep.
So I'm gonna give you guys some homework. Just for R2, I want you to come up with something that you guys will be happy with. Some kind of compromise, because it just seems to be the compromises R2. So what I want you to do is, I want somebody to say, okay, or at least write down on a piece of paper or send me an email or send the commission an email to say they don't like R2. So what do you want us to do objectively so that you guys, we can find a compromise? Because that seems to be the only sticking point, or one of the major sticking points. So what I want the commission to do, I want the council to do for me and for the rest of us, I want you guys to come up with an idea or the ideas to fix that R2 difficulty.
I'm just going to jump back in because one of the things we said we were, exactly, that was one of my points.
Yeah.
And one of my other points is, we'd asked for other tools before we made a decision on this, so we are waiting on some things. Like, I know, thanks to Caitlin Meyer for sending us examples of what the county did with their massing images, but one of the things we'd asked for is give us some visuals, and not from you guys, but from staff, of what does this physically look like in different lots that we can identify as empty or just typical lots in different neighborhoods, so that we in the community can envision what this actually looks like on the ground. So that's one of the things we're waiting on.
She did send that. She sent an email and suggested that we look at the Missing Middle website, which has resources about.
I have Caitlin's one. I just didn't know that was from the county end, but I figured it wasn't Caitlin's job to give us. I figured we were getting something from the city end.
Well, you could start with a website that's organization that's already thought about this a lot. But if you'd like to come from staff, I'm sure they'd be.
Well, I mean, one of the things I find difficult about this, and I'll just say this to people who are considering running for office, which I encourage you to do, and I carry, as soon as they're available, I'm going to be carrying applications. You can get them from me. Is one of the difficult things about this that we've been talking about for a long time is our lack of commitment to a long-term vision plan that will give us more of an idea of where we're headed with all this, because part of what makes this so difficult for a lot of people in the community, regardless of whether you love it or hate it, is not knowing where we're headed and what does this look like. And I think residents are asking, it's a very fair question, what is your long-term vision for what the R2 looks like over time? And I have yet to meet someone who can answer that, and I think we owe that to people. And this crosses over into other things, like our annexation plan. We have a long-term annexation plan that says the city's this blob, the county's this blob, we're willing to expand out to this blob. But unlike other communities, we don't have anything that says this is our long-term land use map, this is what the zones we are aiming for where we want to be. And this is, I think on the city council, but this is for, to help say this is something we want, but this is the zones we anticipate coming in as we go. And so there's a lot of back work, and we're all working our butts off to catch up with stuff we wish we had years ago, but that's one of the things that's honestly making this difficult. And I think we should go on to growth and density. I don't want to take more time.
I mean, but to that too, it's better education. So, I mean, we're learning this, and then we're trying to educate the public about it. And it's so much that happens. Something will get reported in the newspaper, and it's this one byline. But to see physical examples of what quality housing can look like, it can assuage a lot of fears, and that's our job as a council, and it would be, this was just sort of the prep for us to get together and sort of, you guys have one of the most important board commissions that you're on, and as a city, we need that input. So
I just like to point out again, we are trying to find a solution for humans who live in our town who make $11,000 a year or less to $55,000 a year. We're trying to find a solution to that problem. And there are other alternatives. We can create large apartment buildings, but I guarantee you're not gonna want that in your backyard. So I'm just asking you to talk to us a little bit more. We can't predict the future, and we can't tell you what the next development building is going to look like. We do know what a minimum parcel size could look like and what those requirements might look like. And we can change those and tweak those within the R2 to talk about your concerns a little bit more. But I think as far as a future vision goes, we have a zoning plan, and we have envisioned housing that's equitable and walkable to our main street.
Can I, if it's an appropriate time, maybe jump in with maybe some clarifications of at least my concerns and concerns of folks that I have heard about what this might turn into, and maybe some potential solutions. Yeah. So to me, it sounds like a lot of the concerns with, let's just say R2, that keeps coming up with having the pad apply in R2, you're looking at symptoms that are typically associated with higher density housing, regardless of whether or not those symptoms are only associated with high density housing. So you can have parking issues, you can have on-street, if you live in R2, if you live on Tusher today, you could have your next door neighbor have 15 vehicles that took up the entire street, and there is no mechanism to stop that. Right. And where I think I have an issue, and it may be something just doesn't quite rub right with our responsibility to be fair and just to all members of the community is when we only bring up those issues when we're talking about high density, inherently low income housing. And that feels icky, for lack of a better word. And so what I would like to see is us solving those problems in a way that could apply citywide in all situations, regardless of whether or not it's in the PAD. I think the PAD is sort of this microcosm, and we're talking about these things now because it has the potential to really make some changes. But if we had a city code that applied everywhere generally to actually solve the problems that are causing these symptoms across the board, I think it would be fair. It would I think our decision would quite honestly, the council's decision, would sit better with everyone in the community. It wouldn't just look like, frankly, the concerns that I've heard are people worried about the wealthier members of the community trying to protect their neighborhoods so that lower income members of the community don't come in. And I know that's not the intent, but I think we need to be concerned about how that looks and how that appears. And so for something like parking, there is no enforcement mechanism for that now. And what we're doing when we were saying parking spaces for the PAD or limiting the PAD in R2, it would, you would only be solving those concerns in an area where the PAD applies, which is still going to be fairly small, at least from the outset, or maybe just in R2. I mean, I live in R4, people live in R3, people live in all different areas, and aren't they just as deserving of having some of those visual quality of life concerns change? And we brought this up in Planning Commission last time, where if there was some sort of way that we could solve some of these problems that it seems like the PAD is bringing up, like parking, like smell nuisance is something else that came up, light, noise. I mean, we have a noise ordinance. That one is covered already, and I hope folks use it. And code enforcement, it is another issue where we have one code enforcement officer for the whole city, and that's a huge problem. But we'd like, if we had something that said something about light from neighboring properties, something about nuisance smell, something with on-street parking, that could apply across the city. Because again, tomorrow, if you live on Tusher, your neighbor could build a 3-story building and park 12 cars there,
Right.
and you would have nothing to say about it.
Right.
The only difference with the PAD is that now you could have 5 families living there, when before it would just be one person who had all their friends over all the time, or what have you. And so the height restriction, or I think the last red line that the council had reduced the maximum height allowed in R2 to 24 feet. When currently R2, just so everyone knows, allows a 30-foot structure. So what I would like to see, if height is a concern in neighborhoods, I don't think the height concern should just apply when it is a low-income housing unit or units. If we're concerned about height in our neighborhoods, why don't we change the height restrictions citywide in our neighborhoods to 24 feet? I just think if we're saying, okay, you wealthy neighbor can have a 30-foot structure, but low-income housing can't have a 30-foot structure. I strain to find why that is okay. And I think it makes sense. I think most people in town don't want a 30-foot structure next to them if they're living in any residential area. And if that's the concern, let's solve that problem and not just apply it to the PAD. I mean, that's one of the things that came up. But
The thing with the 24-foot height, I think where we came to is that we were hoping not to have 3 levels of housing.
Right.
So, I mean, that's where that was like, okay, well, if we do 24 feet, then you really can't get 3 in there.
But you're right, we're penalizing low-income people with bigger restrictions because we think their behavior is going to be worse.
yeah.
That's why that's why we reduced the height, and that's why we added additional parking. So right now, you could since Tusher's the example, the lots are so small that if you wanted to have more density without the PAD, you could tear down a home and build a duplex, or one on top of the other, and you could go 3 stories. So that's totally allowable right now, and you could totally get the parking. With the
have no requirements about how much parking you have to provide now.
Well,
either,
you would have to have 2 per unit.
Okay.
and the driveways would have to be 20 feet apart. So you'd have to have the frontage, which I think Tusher probably has. So essentially, and Tushers are two. So you can do 2 units, you could go 30 feet, and you could have 4 parking spots, which would be the required, and you could do that tomorrow. Anyone could do that tomorrow. And anyone could live there. With the pad's really not going to apply to those smaller lots, the way that it's written, because you don't get as much. But it really is for larger parcels.
Yeah. But Mike's correct. We want to make sure that anything that is conceivably allowed under whatever the final ordinance is, could happen. And so things like, well, we have it in there, but it won't. I completely can understand that not being a valid excuse for just passing something. So I totally get that concern. But like maybe street width is something that we could do citywide where you can't have, I'm just trying to think of solutions. It sounded like, looking at Rose Tree. Rose Tree's a pretty narrow street. Maybe if that was something that we could apply citywide where it wouldn't just be by zone, which would make it fairer as well. And you could say if your street is X amount wide, you can, I don't know how that would be phrased, if we could kick it back to staff, but I'm just trying to think things that can apply, that can fix a lot of these problems that wouldn't just apply to the pad, because 1, the pad isn't gonna happen many places, and 2, it just seems really unfair. Street width makes sense if we have on-street, you can expect on-street parking. I'm just trying to, I want to help all of Moab, not just the neighborhoods where the pad's going to apply, or the neighborhoods where we, as of now, don't want the pad to apply.
We could add into the pad, we could specifically look at parking and look at street width and street size, and we could look at our engineering requirements for street size and number of vehicle trips that we expect to expand, and we could make that an addition into the pad.
For all zones that the pad applies to, not just R2.
For all zones.
Something like that, it seems fairer on its face, and I think that's something that we're going to be able to defend better as a planning commission and a council to everyone, because you can certainly hear the critiques if it looks like it's being protectionist of.
So what we're trying to do is
certain areas for no conceivable reason other than they are certain areas.
Our goal is to really, through design requirements from the city, protect people and provide ample parking and ample space for people. So that is one of our goals. Kaylin, what did you mean by proforms, and what kind of things?
Pro forma.
What did you have in mind for maybe some additional requirements for PAD? Just like some brainstorming, some ideas of maybe things that we're missing out that other cities have already thought about.
The pro forma is where you just pencil out the economics of a development, which to inform, like right now, there's an affordability requirement, and if there was, it may be impractical, and a little analysis could reveal that, and because we want developers to build it too. So that wasn't that was more the income restrictions that are currently in the pad. So that is not, and my concern is actually more making sure that they happen, which doesn't really necessarily, maybe some people would prefer that we set them so high that it never gets used, and that would effectively solve the problem, and we wouldn't have to worry about the form. In terms of the form, it seems like some ideas are to if multiple lots were being redeveloped, there could be a large apartment buildings which would be out of character with the area, and so that might look like a floor size footprint maximum. But
do you guys think in R2 we should have a footprint that's the same as the existing requirement for the other residential structures?
That would defeat the whole purpose of the pad, at least.
You could still own the property, and you could own a small unit, but you would have the same footprint maximum as any other house in the R2.
Well, the intention with that is to have a footprint maximum for the building so that it stays in character with the rest of the neighborhood, so you don't end up with one really large building amongst a bunch of smaller buildings.
So the footprint size with the pad, we think is, how would we adjust that to make it more appropriate to fit within the residential character?
I'm not sure. I didn't come prepared to work through all these issues. I guess my understanding of our roadmap was a little different.
And something like that could work too. It sounds like at least the main concern is the one single, which is not what our intent was with Planning Commission either, was to just have apartment buildings everywhere. The idea is you'd have more fourplexes and fiveplexes, and you'd have a cool building here with the side entrance and a 2-bedroom apartment here and a 3-bedroom upstairs, and then like a tiny house out back or something like that, just encouraging something that would be creative and nice and stick with the character. So maybe, I mean, the footprint, you could see the footprint working, because then you would inherently, you wouldn't limit the number of units, but you maybe would limit connected units, which would work to that character issue. Because the character, I mean, I really do understand the character issue.
Yeah. I think that's a tweak that we can, like you said, we didn't come prepared, but I think that's a tweak that I would like everybody to give input on, that we will make.
But let me circle back to the height discussion.
Sure.
Because I had originally raised an issue about maintaining access to sun for residences. And I thought that initially I thought we might address it in PAD, and then I realized, oh, this should be a concern. This is a concern we want to address for everyone, and maybe we should address it at least zone-wide, if not city-wide, and let's not do it specific to the PAD. But then this 24-foot height limit appeared, which seemed like a good compromise in the interim while we continue to work on things. But that's an area where I think maybe a tapered setback, so we still maintain the same height limit or even higher, but keep that maximum height away from because
the edges.
The edges, because yes, the setbacks are the same for a pad development, but it's only 7 feet on the side, which is, if you actually have a parapet roof, 30-foot building, 7 feet from the property line, that could be a little imposing.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be taken aback if that went up next to.
Yeah.
Okay, and in this, it's totally allowable right now.
Yes.
Yes, but in the absence of the density incentive, people are much less likely to want to exercise that.
Very true.
Yeah.
But I am happy to. I would prefer to address it at the zone level rather than pad specific.
Right.
Yeah.
There is, like in Utah and in Utah law, there have been cases where one neighbor will build a house and destroy someone's solar access or their view shed. And that would be a case that they could bring to court, and that it could be defended that you couldn't build a new building that would destroy a view shed.
Yeah, and we don't have view shed in our code right now, and I think, I mean, look at where we live. That's something that, I mean, really, I think, and I'm probably going to be accused of like way going over the scope of what this meeting is for, but I think a lot of the things we're talking about, there's some really simple that could be very, very popular with most folks in town, overall city code tweaks that could happen that could assuage a lot of the concerns about high density housing and also just generally up the quality of life in town.
So when I was like interviewing the three of you about being on Planning Commission, I said, stuff's gonna come at you and you're gonna have to make a decision and then pass it on to council. But if something doesn't sit right, it's your opportunity to workshop and work through and present this council with changes. So, permission, encouraged to do that for us. I think the question is, do we need to do that before we pass the PAD, or can we pass the PAD and concurrently work on some of these larger changes? Because I know we have that slated in 2019 to do, through our planning department as well, the code revision for Chapter 17. So step one was the taking conditional uses out, and then step two is going to be a look, a revisit of the Chapter 17. So I think it's up to you as a planning commission too, like to circle back on these ideas that you're having and bring these ideas to the council for consideration. So I would say yes, do that, please.
I mean, I don't know. I think there's incentive, and certainly at the last council meeting, I was in the audience, and there were a lot of folks who talked about the importance of getting this passed as quickly as possible while it's still being reasonable, because the need is there and it's real, and the pad is set up to provide affordable housing in one of the quicker ways that the city can facilitate. So I don't know if these are. I mean, it's up to the council if these are deal breakers, that the height, the R2 stuff, things like that, or if the pad could go forward now, because, I mean, you have to anticipate if the pad passes at the next city council meeting, someone could bring their application in the following day and then start and have their site plan approved, and then that's already a site plan that's approved. So, the things that folks are concerned about now could ostensibly happen, and so if those concerns, if you don't want to let any go through before citywide zone code changes are made, then, or could there be something that's written into the pad that says maybe 24 feet for now? I mean, if there could be, right. I'm just worried about it being just and the commitment of the council to revisit these issues citywide as soon as possible, and not just basically squeak through saying, yep, there's a 24-foot height restriction just in the R zones, for instance.
Well, and we did agree, council, correct me if I'm wrong, to have a public hearing at our next city council meeting, which is the December 11th meeting, specifically on PAD, correct?
It's a town hall.
Oh, that's right, town hall, sorry. And I should have known that because I did it.
Is there public input in that?
Yes.
Yeah, so the town hall is gonna be like more of a back and forth instead of public hearing.
Which we had. The public hearing for the pad was at Planning Commission.
Yeah.
But we're hoping for much more active and useful dialogue at that time. Does anybody hear that?
Well, you had two people.
Well, so, and
people
specifically, the council members that are still having concern really wanted to do this town hall to have this back and forth. So it's good.
I would like to remind everybody that the people who will take advantage of affordable housing are probably not going to make it to town hall because they're working 3 jobs. Exactly. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I'd like to mention that we would be more than comfortable making some small tweaks to things that we talked about, like road size and revisiting the R2 and looking at the economic viability of doing this. And I can tell you right now, even if we do a study, this isn't going to cut it. This isn't going to solve, this isn't a one and done kind of thing that's going to solve our housing problem. We need to look at other things like the city giving incentives to developers. We choose the architect, we give them the incentive, and they build it. So if you guys would like us to look at other affordable housing options and send that with you in a couple weeks when you vote on PAD with our revisions, we're more than happy to do that.
Well, just to be clear, because just to be super clear, this council is not passing the PAD back to Planning Commission to make further revisions.
Correct. Thank goodness.
The PAD is with us to make any final tweaks we want, and then either we're going to vote for it or we're going to vote against it. Right, council? That's right? We're not sending it back to Planning Commission for further revision, correct?
It's not my intention, but I believe it is the prerogative of the body as a whole to do that, should they so choose, but I am not in favor of that.
Planning Commission will reject it. No, I'm just kidding. We don't want it anymore.
Yeah, you guys
Jeanette
will
quit.
I think you guys are well aware of your toolbox that you have as far as setbacks, footprint sizes, and following the building code, which are already there. So I encourage you to look at those zoning tools that we've already taught you about and that you've learned about, and to use those to kind of formulate your vision of what the R2 looks like.
So, Madam Mayor, to be perfectly clear, Jeanette asked for feedback from us about specific ideas we might use to make us recalcitrants over here in R2 land more comfortable. I'd be delighted to do that. May I do so?
You could do it on a council level, but I think just for maybe just to be in the loop, I think for future, any big things we're doing, which is, there's gonna be a lot of changes. I think I'd like to be in that loop as far as what you guys are discussing about R2 and what you're, I mean, just because we actually, you know, we tried to author this and city staff has worked on it for years and stuff, but actually to actually say, that's a sticking point. It just sits wrong with me because it's like everything that was brought up on a commission level totally rings very true. And I think the us against them, commission against council, that's got to stop. And so for us to be part of that conversation, even if we're basically done with it, at least for my personal opinion, I'd like to see that. So that is up to you guys as a council. But for my personal opinion, I'd like to see what we could do better, so that we don't have to be sitting here for 4 years and dealing with this.
I'd like everybody too in the city council who doesn't agree with this to please offer your recommendations for what you think should happen, because we've had unlimited discussion and we've exhausted our resources on what we think should happen as far as the pad goes, and we're hearing criticism, but we're not hearing any new ideas. So
well, Mike did present an idea, which was to take R2 out of the pad, but right?
Well,
to not allow pad be applied to R2.
No, I'm gonna. I'll agree to put R2 in, but I want an expanded list of restrictions, if you will, to mitigate concerns of neighbors. And I've mentioned some of them tonight. Some of them are already in there, the height and parking spaces and so forth, but I've suggested a series of others. I would like to just to list those. This is just me talking to the chair of the planning commission, okay? She can do anything with it she wants.
At this point, this is with you. It's not coming back to the planning commission. The tweaks and the changes will be made by you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the things that don't sit well with you, we are here as an educated planning commission to help you tweak those things so that this is something that sits well with you.
Yeah, I value your feedback, I really do. And having sat for many years where you guys are sitting, I'd feel really ticked, all right, if I got cut out of the loop at this point.
So the footprint size, I think was something you were worried about, right? How much density can there be?
Well, we're running out of time, with all due respect. I think I ought to quit, but if I may, Emily, may I at least letter on my own behalf, suggest my own things? I can copy you guys if you wish.
I'm going to support whatever this council wants to do.
Okay, so, I'm trying to find a compromise that we're all happy with here.
Yeah.
So, but Mike, they're just saying that it's for us to work out those tweaks. I mean, and
use us, or ask us. I mean, you're talking about examples of what things would look like. We looked at all that when we were doing this. We had those articles printed out about tiny homes. We have all that stuff that we considered as a planning commission, and you know, we passed it on to you. But if you have specific questions, like, I think that's why this has been great, because you've been able to say, okay, here's the issue with the R2, and sort of like break that down. But I mean, I guess continue to ask those questions, because we can also explain a lot of our reasoning that if you didn't attend every single planning commission meeting or watch them on the YouTube feed, you wouldn't know. I think are important, because there are some things that I know even members of the community here tonight feel slightly differently about having heard the reason behind it in the pad or where we were coming from, and if that can help council too, I think that's important. So I think that was your point, right? Just continue to, ask those questions and email us and use us and keep us in the loop. And, you know, if there's some change you're going to make, you know, if you want to run it by our opinion informally, like, that's great.
It's totally fine. I don't.
Yeah, you have your email addresses, phone numbers. We are happy to use all of our skill set and planning to work with you to make something that you understand that you are happy with.
So I made a suggestion back at the very beginning of this year when I was like, yay, I'm the new mayor. And it was to create a tie between, a closer tie between the council and the planning commission. And it was that we would buddy up, that every council member would have a planning commission buddy to be able to go to, ask questions, get a recap of the meeting. I think that's probably still worth it. It doesn't have to be formal, but if you look at somebody on the other side, or at the, you know, I don't want to say we're not on sides, but if you see somebody that's not on your council, that's, you know what I'm saying, find a buddy for both of us. You know, if you on the planning commission want to buddy up with somebody on council or vice versa to get questions answered, I think that's good.
I think the planning commission would feel more supported too if we had the buddy system. We would know what you guys are thinking, and you would know what we're thinking.
We could, you know, at least have some pointed conversation about rationale about where you came to certain decisions. Yeah. To address just sort of the informal questions, but I want to say something too, because I know that, you know, we noticed this as a conversation about growth and density, and while we're focusing on the pad, I do think that all of the comments that we're having, the conversation we're having and the comments that we're making really do apply to this idea of growth and density and where we're comfortable with it and where it's uncomfortable. And so even though we're sort of narrowed into the pad, I do think it has expanded to a bigger conversation and is going to continue to lead us through this conversation. I just wanted to recognize that, just because Ronnie, you had said, you know, well, I want to talk about this, and I do feel like there's, you know, at least having the pad as like our example of what, you know, that brings out why we're comfortable or not comfortable with density has been helpful.
Definitely.
At least at this meeting.
And we're not unique. There was an article today in the Trib about growth and density on the Wasatch Front, and at least we are not in their enviable position of needing 50,000 units tomorrow. So.
And at least we don't live on the Wasatch Front.
Yeah. Somebody was saying
I'm gonna get in trouble for
the other day that Moab Valley, our valley is the size of Manhattan. And so to just put it in perspective, somebody thought that it was healthy and safe for that many people to live on that small of a parcel. And that's like waterlocked. So we're not trying to be Manhattan either.
No, I think it's 27 miles long.
Not at all.
And to the vision too, like this idea of like where do we envision like R2, R3, R4? I think that there is still sort of this, you know, lower density character, but in communities where I've lived, there is sort of a single family, then there's a duplex, and then a couple other single families, and then there's a fourplex, and then a single duplex, fourplex, and the pad could help us actualize that. I like the floor plan thing, or footprint.
Maybe footprint. I mean, look at our zoning map. We're not, our zoning is pretty wonky here in town, and I know that's part of the long-term vision is smoothing things out and making things a little more cohesive and less, you know, spot zoning and things. But I mean, you have single-family houses next to a hotel, next to a restaurant, next to a bar. I mean, everything's kind of interspersed, which is, I think, is kind of a cool thing about town. It's just making sure that, you know, it's not in a way that diminishes the character of our town, where you don't have to drive 10 miles to get somewhere when you want to go somewhere, and you can walk and you can bike. And I think that's just my concern, is I don't want to push anyone to the fringes of the community because they might need to. Do we need to do that do we need to do that formally? No, I don't think we do.
That's like picking teams or something. That would be so uncomfortable.
I thought we left this in gym class in 10th
Yeah.
grade.
Thank you.
But we should. We should, after we're done with this, when we turn the YouTube off.
Maybe I want to change buddies.
Yeah,
How's
maybe.
that?
So, can I just quickly ask, so do we see getting together again and like having a bigger discussion of other alternatives and our downtown zone, our, like the visioning?
So we have scheduled a meeting with Kenner Kingston, who's an ambassador for the Living Future Institute on December 12th. It's from 10 to
11 to 3.
11 to 3, thank you. And I'm not saying that that's like, you know, the go-to, but it is a method of understanding like a more holistic and sustainable way of growing in a community. So I don't know if any of you are available on that day to attend with us, but that would be really cool.
I can't.
What is it again,
I'll be
December 12th?
December 12th.
It's a weekday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weekday, 11 to 3.
Right here?
Here. Which it kind of, you know, what you were saying, Ronnie, is really true. This idea of growth isn't just about density, it's also about capacity and water and resources. And it's at least another piece for us to look at. So I'm excited about having that, and I'm grateful this council is willing to do that as possible lead into more vision workshops. Our next joint meeting is going to be when? When are we going to do that? David? January or February. So we're just, it's in the future. At our next council meeting, we're going to be approving dates for 2019. So at that point, we'll have the joint, sort of the quarterly joint meetings laid out. And that's good. So it'll be January or February, the next time we come together.
But we can all talk in the interim and figure things out.
Yes.
Without having a quorum.
Yeah, I was gonna say, without violating the Open Public Meetings Act,
Yes.
please.
Yes, you can.
I'd like to thank Marianne, Kaya, Karn, others, whom I may have missed, for helping get this meeting going. I think it's been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, are we done? I don't know if I need to call for a motion to adjourn, but I'll do it, just to be formal.
Motion to adjourn the meeting.
Great.
Second.
Great. Favor?